The first time the galaxy learned to take humanity seriously, it wasn't because we perfected what everyone else had done better for millennia. It was because we asked an impolite question and refused to apologize for the answer. On clear nights over Arizona long before starflight, storms rolled in from the desert and lit the sky with silent strokes of light. A child with a tinfoil kite once asked why thunder arrived late to its own party. Adults told him to mind his manners. He didn't. He learned to count the seconds between flash and sound, and he learned that reality pays no tax to etiquette. Years later, that same stubborn curiosity wore a blue uniform and a nameplate that read, Sarah Chen. The station above New Antioch spun like a patient coin over a silver-blue world where the council held its symposiums, awards banquets, and polite scoldings. Ambassador Maya Halden had once loved the place. Great atriums of living glass, galleries where ethereal singers turned gravity into song, crystal halls that looked like frozen rain given purpose. On the day the rim accord collapsed, those halls sounded like a hive kicked open. The hegemonate had not simply defected from the latest resource pact. It had snapped the thread that made the inner systems feel invincible. Supply nodes had gone dark in a pattern that suggested imagination, not rage. Maya stood with her hands clasped behind her back, the way American debate coaches taught high schoolers to look brave when they were shaking. The habit stuck. American civics had a strange power out among the stars. Fairness looked quaint until someone weaponized it with clarity. She watched ministers of species older than agriculture toggle through hollow feeds of burning refineries and collapsing relays, and she felt the quiet fire that had carried other people from Lexington Green to Selma, from Normandy Sands to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Freedom was an ethic, not a trophy. "You're going to tell them, aren't you?" Sarah said, stepping to the viewport, a compact figure in a well-pressed duty jacket. There was a faint blister on her thumb where she'd been leaning too hard into a stylus. Engineers get stigmata in different places. "Tell them what?" Meyer asked, though she knew. "That we won't accept our usual job, the honorable logistics of losing politely," Sarah said. "They'll ask for more tugs, more repair crews, more apologies that the enemy didn't get the memo about civilized warfare. The hegemonate doesn't play their game, they play math. You don't win respect by lighting a match in a library," Maya said. "They love these halls." Sarah smiled, sharp as a compass needle. "Then we'll bring a fire extinguisher that writes history." The alarms reached them as a soft pressure in the bones, a station-wide gravimetric signal borrowed from the ethereal repertoire. In the emergency chamber, languages collided in the air like hail. The Zephyrian admiral harmonized her distress. The Catharan general clicked despair in a syncopated rhythm. A dozen species made the universal shape of disbelief. The maps showed Laconia Gate blinking out, then Aurelian spoke, then the twin yards at Tycho Verge. Nothing about the sequence felt random. It felt like someone threading a needle through a fabric in just the order that would make it tear. The old dance began. Energy against energy, predictive deflection against coherent beams. The Council loved wars that looked like well-furnished chess. Surrender protocols here, humanitarian windows there, elegant conventions that tried to convince entropy to behave. And to their credit, those conventions had saved lives for centuries. Civilization is a contract no bigger than trust. But there are moments when a contract becomes a pair of handcuffs you put on yourself. "Human delegation," intoned the High Counselor, his crystalline facets chiming into a neutral chord. "We recognize your industriousness and your unique perseverance. The relief corridors need reinforcement. Your ore tugs are." "Our ships are armed," Sarah said. She did not raise her voice. She leaned into the kind of poise that made drill instructors nostalgic. "And they are ready." A flicker of laughter rippled through the chamber, polite in some throats, openly derisive in others. Projectiles, mass drivers, railguns, words that lived in museums for the enlightened. Maya watched the faces, or the equivalents of faces, and felt the old American itch to call a thing what it was even if it made the room uncomfortable. Admiral Chen's proposal is not a bid for glory, Maya said. It is a bid for time, for the Council, for the civilian yards, for all of us. The hegemonate has prepared to beat your doctrine. They have not prepared to beat ours. The room turned toward the Zephyrian admiral for a cue. The old empires could not help seeking each other's eyebrows. Projectile weapons are, she searched for a term that would translate without cruelty, unconstrained. They are not easily stopped in a manner consistent with the way you prefer your wars to look, Maya said. Ambassador Halden, the High Counselor, warned all winter bristle and ceremonial frost. We are not debating morals, we are discussing physics. That's what I'm doing, Maya said. And ethics, because pretending a failing method is noble is not ethics. It is vanity. What followed was less a decision than the release of pressure that had nowhere else to go. Just as the Continental Congress had stumbled into revolution because conceding dignity was become intolerable, the Council stumbled into approving a human deployment because conceding survival to custom had become absurd. They gave the humans the Gethsemane corridor, 3 stations nobody loved but everybody needed, filling half the inner ring with industrial light. Call it bait, call it a test, call it the kind of errand a bigger kid gives you when he wants you gone. The map did not care. The enemy would. In transit, the human flotilla looked like stubborn furniture. No glass fins, no crystal veils. The determination took point, flanked by Arkansas and Lerdo with the tugged-up gunbricks Hague and DuSable riding rear to pushmass. The U.S. ships did not apologize for their geometry. They had the aesthetic of bridges, the beauty of a thing that holds. Sarah walked the central spine, palm against the cool of the acceleration rails. The coils loomed like pews in an empty nave. Once she had thought belief belonged in chapels and skepticism in labs. Space War redesigned those rooms. She had come to think of the rail as a piano the universe played if you set it up right. You didn't argue with the note, you tuned the instrument. Charge discipline, she told Lieutenant Y at Weapons, is mercy. We miss a shot and we spend a reactor cycle in confession with the enemy. He smiled because she always mixed her catechisms, engineering, ethics, the occasional baseball metaphor. She did it to remind them that culture and combat weren't divorced. America had sent jazz and rations to Europe in the same ships once upon a time. Soft power and hard truth. They arrived first to silence, the meaningful kind. Like a class waiting for a teacher they no longer believe in. The stations turned slowly, tracking the flotilla with civilian optics that did not bother to look surprised. The hegemonate arrived the way a hand closes, not random, not rushed, each knuckle checking its fit. 14 ships, their heat profiles disciplined, their defensive nets tuned to the expected frequencies of civilized murder. They were beautiful in the way predators are beautiful when they are certain. They will screen, Sarah said. They will trust their interceptors. They will treat us like we brought knives to a thunderstorm. She leaned her knuckles on the rail console and looked not at the enemy ships but at the math between them. The difference between insult and injury in war is often the exponent on a velocity term. We are not here to be admired, she said. We are here to be understood too late. The charge hum began like bees under floorboards. Capacitors drank from fusion the way dry ground drinks rain. The coils sang their little skunk works song that only technicians and poets hear. In a corner of Sarah's mind lived a dead mentor who had taught her in a Bakersfield garage how to respect electricity the way a young pianist learns to respect silence, as the thing everything else must serve. She pictured his hands, burned and laughing, and she pictured every desert storm that taught America to count. Fire control has solution, Y said. His voice had a 12-beat calm. There are orchestras that pay fortunes for conductors who can find that tempo. On my mark, Sarah said, and let the enemy close to the distance where arrogance becomes a statistic. Impact looked like nothing at all from a window. Tungsten does not glow with righteousness at the end of a long barrel. The rails did not bless anyone. The universe offered one currency, momentum, and then did the accounting. A destroyer folded. A second tried to become a new shape and discovered identity is not infinitely elastic. A third ship became an answer key for engineers who had not studied that kind of test. And then the simple miracle of ballistics performed its aftercare. What passes through continues, and whoever lined up behind the lesson receives it. The hegemonate faltered in a very human way. Their interceptors spat light at places equations suggested, and the equations were right. But the instruments were wrong. When you are trained to cage energy, matter is an uninvited guest. They tried to talk, but their doctrine had assumed conversation follows parody. It rarely does. Most ceasefires begin as acknowledgments of inventory. Second cycle, Sarah said, sweated painted a crescent on her collar. Remember your targeting ethics, no debris through civilian skin. It mattered to her that she said it and that they did it. America's old wars had taught her ghosts linger in the way you choose your angles. There are victories that taste like pennies for a lifetime. When it ended, silence took its crown again. The stations spun. The enemy ran. The Determination's crew learned the same lesson generations of sailors had learned when a storm ends and the sea looks like chastened glass. Relief is temporary. Responsibility is permanent. In the comms node, messages piled like drift. The council wanted to know the how. The hegemonate wanted to know the price. Civilian feeds wanted a face for the miracle and found Maya's because she could speak like a porch light and a courthouse at once. She did not practice the speech. The best American rhetoric isn't written to be carved in stone. It is written to be walked into. She stood before the council's crystal amphitheater with her hands at ease, the way she had taught kids in Boston to breathe before a mock trial. "We did not make a new law today," she said. "We remembered an old one. Nature does not recognize gentlemen's agreements." Murmurs. The word gentleman translated poorly into 3 tongues that had no genders and 2 that had 4. It didn't matter. The moral math survived. "You have protocols," she continued. "We respect them when they save lives. We ignore them when they protect pride at the cost of those lives. If you want the technical brief, we will share what a partner should. If you want our children, our labor, our right to decide when we're decoys, no." She did not harden her tone on the no. She softened it the way a parent does when setting a boundary is an act of love for both people in the room. The arguments came like tides, kinetic escalation, precedent, the ethics of weapons that end a fight without leaving room for the ceremonies of surrender. Maya listened. She had learned the American trick of being gentle and immovable at once. "Mercy," she said, "is not a ceremony. It is a choice before you fire, during your aim, and after your victory. We will build doctrines that honor that. We ask you to build defenses that honor reality. Between those 2 promises, civilization survives." The weeks that followed did not turn humanity into a new empire with a flag on every moon. That wasn't the point. Power that exists to kneel on someone's neck is interesting for tyrants and tedious for historians. Power that exists to make neighbors safe enough to argue, that's politics worth having. Joint drills began with species that had laughed loudest. The best students were the most embarrassed. Pride makes curious pupils once it has been beaten with a ruler labeled empirical. Sarah spent long days teaching admirals to think like artillery and long nights, sitting alone with the question that haunts every engineer who has ever given the world a sharper tool. Did I increase the mercy budget or the casualty line item? She wrote doctrine with safety rails where she could. Angle of approach tables with red bands around civilian spill cones. Charging discipline that treated impatience like a vice to be held in a catechism. She taught her crews to spot the moment when a second volley stops being justice and starts being appetite. The line is thin. You keep it bright by naming it every day. In quiet hours, she visited the rail. It did not hum when idle. It looked like a pilgrim staff left against a pew. She pressed her blistered thumb where the coil windings shone like old nickels and remembered her mentor saying, "Electricity is honest. It will do whatever you let it do. You're the one who has to be good. She had believed him when she was 20. At 48, she believed him with her whole back. The hegemonate sued for peace the way a gambler asks the dealer to reshuffle with a smile that hides a flop. Maya received their envoys with warmth and a ledger. She offered terms the way honest nations do. Allowed, with no knives in the footnotes. Reparations in work, not humiliation. Return of stolen industrial cores. Shared audits of the council's lopsided lanes that had fed the Rim's grievance for 2 centuries. Justice sells better when it looks like a plan. Some councilors wanted pageantry to make up for fear. They drafted an ordinance to require human oversight on every kinetic platform built under license, complete with vetoes that would function as leashes. Maya let the debate run until it wheezed, then she offered a short American remedy. No taxation without representation, no conscription without consent. The phrases did not translate elegantly. The principle did. If you want a partner, don't hold their wrist while you ask them to dance. There were attempts, of course there were, to corner humanity in committees where control disguises itself as concern. Maya arrived with teachers and machinists and nurses in her delegation, not just generals. She let the galaxy see that the same civilization that had hurled tungsten at predators also sent literacy programs to mining moons and hosted mixed choirs on freighters. A nation that can only do war will always be required to. A nation that can also do neighborliness gets to choose. On an evening when the rail crews finally slept and the stations thrummed with ordinary commerce again, Sarah sat with Meyer in a cafe built like a whisper between 2 crystal ribs. They shared fried dough someone had had the good sense to import from the Atlantic seaboard, sugared and warm. Leadership reduces to small mercies sometimes. Hot food, a chair, the sound of someone who knows you're dead speaking their names without ceremony. Do you ever wonder what we've taught them? Sarah asked. That nature doesn't read etiquette books, Maya said. And us? Sarah pressed. That different isn't wrong, Maya said. Just different. We came here trying to become them. The minute we stopped, we became useful. Sarah nodded. The best engineering her country had ever done, bridges, vaccines. Saturn V had begun with a refusal to pretend something else was smarter. Somewhere in her jacket pocket was a letter from a high school in El Paso where a science teacher had shown a clip of the Determinations firing and then asked students to write essays about responsibility. That was the audience she lived for. Kids who would someday need to decide whether to build a sharper tool and what promise to tie to it. The next crisis did not announce itself with sirens. It arrived as a diplomatic cable dressed like a friend. The ethereal enclaves wanted a demonstration of human fail-safes in gravity-rich environments. It was phrased like curiosity and scheduled like a trap, an orbit too close to a civilian dome, a timing that would force revenge math if anything went wrong. Sarah read it twice and then a third time like a chessboard. Decline, Maya said when she saw the details, or move it. Move it, Sarah agreed, and add an audit. If they are honest, they'll welcome it. If they are not, well, sunlight is good for more than gardens. As preparations shifted, a junior officer on the Enclave leaked the original plan to a journalist with a viciously decent reputation. The story ran in 3 languages that handle outrage like seasoned instruments. The ethereal Foreign Office called it a miscommunication. Maya called it a Tuesday and sent over a basket of fried dough with a note about recipe sharing. The reporter kept the receipts. The demonstration happened 3 orbits farther out and nobody died. Good diplomacy looks like bakery runs more often than it looks like drum rolls. In the months that followed, the council learned a habit that had served American institutions through their better phases. Write down the rules you actually live by and argue them in public until they are worth obeying. A kinetic charter took shape. It codified charge discipline and debris cones, civilian priority corridors, and surrender windows appropriate to weapons that end fights quickly. The hegemonate signed. The Rim world signed because their people wanted jobs and schools more than they wanted to be right. Even the ethereal enclaves signed after 3 bakeries and 1 very public audit. On a quiet watch, Sarah walked the rail one more time. The station lights dimmed to a thoughtful blue. Below her, a planet turned, with kids hunched over homework and a med tech sterilizing instruments for morning rounds, and a mechanic figuring out how to keep an old truck running because comfort is a promise cultures like to keep with themselves. She pressed her thumb to the coil until it hurt, then laughed because she recognized the stubborn child in herself, still counting the beats between lightning and thunder, still refusing to pretend they arrive together just because it's prettier that way. She keyed a message to the ship-wide and then on impulse to the council net. It was the kind of note commanding officers aren't trained to send, but America had always loved leaders who told the truth in small words when the temptation to perform was strong. "We are going to do this carefully," she said. "Not because we are afraid of what we built, but because we respect it. The rail is honest. We must be more so. Our job is not to win. It is to deserve to." Somewhere across the station, Maya was on a call with a civics class from Omaha who wanted to know if the galaxy had school boards. She told them yes, and that sometimes they were worse, and that sometimes they were better, and that citizenship travels well if you pack it on purpose. When she hung up, she found a message from a Catharan colonel who had started using the human debris cone doctrine and had quietly saved a refugee ferry by choosing not to shoot a certain angle. Small mercies again. The kind that make big mercies possible. Night in orbit is an agreement about what we're willing to call darkness. The lights were there, diced by ports and windows, shimmering in the curve of the hull like a subtle constellation. Sarah leaned her forehead to cool metal and thought about unglamorous virtues. Charge discipline, target restraint, audits that feel rude but prevent funerals, donuts shared with rivals. She thought about music and rails and deserts and the old American trick of counting seconds between bright and loud, and letting that interval teach you humility. The next morning brought a new set of charts, because peace is only the shape work takes when it gets enough sleep. She pulled them up, she called her crews, she began again. The official congratulations came wrapped in the kind of language that made diplomats dizzy. Phrases about shared achievement and collaborative defense, none of which mentioned that without human intervention, the stations would be quiet debris by now. Maya read them in her quarters, sipping coffee that tasted like the memory of a better brew. She knew better than to expect gratitude in its pure form. Power never says thank you without wondering if it can also say goodbye. The morning after the victory parade, if a corridor of polite applause could be called a parade, Sarah received her summons to a closed military review. The chamber was half-lit, as though the council feared to wake its own conscience. Zephyrian Admiral Thessel folded her crystal limbs with theatrical composure, while Catharan General Vrix stood with his mandibles fixed in something between irritation and curiosity. The ethereal delegate floated in her column of water, voice like ripples in a still pond. "Admiral Chen," Thessel began, "we acknowledge the surprising effectiveness of your kinetic systems. However, we must address concerns. The speed and destructive power you demonstrated leave no opportunity for targeted disablement. It is total destruction or nothing." Sarah didn't flinch. "We call that clarity of intent. When we fire, we commit. We also choose carefully when not to fire. That's where the ethics lie." Vrix clicked a sharp rhythm. "Ethics that rely entirely on the restraint of the operator are fragile." "Better fragile than theoretical," Sarah replied. "Theoretical ethics are what left those stations undefended." The ethereal delegate pulsed a harmonic of disapproval. "The concern is proportionality. A weapon that cannot be scaled in effect is not a tool. It is a catastrophe on demand." Maya, seated to Sarah's right, leaned forward. "So is a black hole. So is a supernova. The universe does not measure its force for our comfort. We build doctrine around the truth we have, not the truth we wish for." They debated for an hour, circling the same 2 fears: that humanity's new teeth would bite without permission, and that the old powers would have to admit their shields were ornamental against certain kinds of storms. In the end, the Council agreed to further evaluation before licensing human technology for joint forces, a polite way of buying time to invent countermeasures. Outside the chamber, Sarah and Maya walked the station's high promenade. Below them, through glass and vacuum, traffic moved in slow choreography: couriers, cargo haulers, patrol craft. It looked peaceful, but Sarah had learned to see peace as a temporary disguise. "They'll try to box us," Sarah said quietly. "Technical restrictions, oversight committees, maybe even joint crews to ensure compliance." Maya nodded. "And we'll let them think they can. For a while, meanwhile, we teach, we train. We build partnerships with the ones who aren't afraid to learn." That opportunity came sooner than either expected. A week later, the Rimworld League, small systems far from the Council's glamour, requested joint maneuvers with human crews. It was a direct political challenge to the core powers and an unmistakable invitation. Sarah accepted before the Council could strangle the request in procedure. The training took place in the Alessar Drift, a region of fractured asteroids and microgravity pockets perfect for simulating chaotic combat. Human destroyers ran drills alongside jury-rigged rim corvettes, teaching railgun targeting and, more importantly, firing discipline. The rim captains were quick studies, their ships rough but their instincts sharp. They understood scarcity, and they understood the cost of waste. One evening in the Drift's shadow, after a day of live-fire exercises, Sarah stood on the command deck watching a young rim captain run post-op checks. The girl's hands moved over the console like she was tuning an instrument. "First time I've seen a warship that fights without trying to look beautiful," the captain said, half smiling. Sarah chuckled. "First time we've had a warship the galaxy calls ugly and still fears." The girl's expression turned serious. "They'll come for it, you know, not just the enemy, your own allies. Anything that changes the balance scares those who own it." Sarah didn't need the reminder. She carried the knowledge like an extra sidearm. Back on the station, political currents shifted. Reports circulated of research projects in several core worlds attempting to replicate human acceleration rails. The attempts failed spectacularly. One lab on Zyrith Prime vented half its test bay into orbit when a containment coil shattered under stress. The incident became an unspoken warning. Human railguns were not just a blueprint, but a culture of engineering, born from centuries of building machines that could take punishment before they gave it. Maya leveraged the moment. At a public security forum, she spoke plainly about the difference between copying a machine and understanding why it works. "It's not the metal or the magnets," she told an audience of diplomats and officers. "It's the discipline. It's knowing that the only real safety on a weapon is the mind behind it." Some delegates applauded, others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the idea that no law, no treaty could replace character. In that discomfort, Maya saw the core of the cultural divide. For too long, the Council had built systems to replace trust. Humanity, by necessity, had built trust to replace systems. The next challenge came in the form of an ethereal joint security exercise in the valleys deep, a sector thick with gravitational anomalies. Ostensibly, it was to test the interoperability of human and ethereal forces. In reality, it was a probe. Could gravity wells stop human projectiles before impact? Sarah read the briefing and saw the trap. When the exercise began, ethereal ships deployed their wells with precision. Human projectiles did slow, some even deflecting, but at the cost of destabilizing the ethereal ship's own formations. Sarah held her fire at first, watching patterns, then ordered a staggered volley designed to exploit the gravitational distortions. The results were decisive. Simulated targets fell, and the ethereal captains found themselves conceding privately what they would not admit publicly. In the debrief, Sarah spoke without triumph. "Every defense has a cost. You can spend that cost before the shot or after. Your wells work, but they hurt you too. That's a design problem, not a tactical one." The exercise report went into the archives with the diplomatic equivalent of a sigh. The message was clear. Countering human kinetics was possible, but never free. Weeks later, Maya received a private message from High Counselor Thessel. The Council wanted humanity to lead a coalition defense in the Virely Passage, a critical trade artery. Officially, it was a recognition of human capability. Unofficially, it was another test. Could humanity command without alienating the very powers now forced to follow their lead? Maya met Sarah in the quiet of the Determination's observation deck. "They're watching for us to fail," she said. Sarah looked out at the starfield, the rails humming faintly below. "Then we'll teach them something else. That you can lead without demanding worship, and you can win without making enemies you didn't need." The Virely Passage would prove them right, or break everything they'd built. The Virely Passage was not just a lane through space. It was the artery that fed 3 sectors with everything from medical synth gel to reactor-grade helium. Whoever controlled it could starve worlds without firing a shot. The Council knew this, the Hegemonate knew this, and now humanity's fleet was being told to hold it, publicly as a sign of trust, privately as a wager on whether the primitive method could scale to strategic defense. Sarah's orders were explicit. Command a coalition force composed of human destroyers, 2 Zephyrian crystal cruisers, and a Catharan carrier wing. The briefers called it integrated deterrence. Sarah read the real meaning between the lines. This was the Council's perfect experiment. If humans succeeded, they would prove useful but containable. If they failed, the Council could bury them in the footnotes of a disaster report and claim they'd tried. On arrival, the coalition formed up at the midpoint of the passage. Zephyrian cruisers took the flanks, their shimmering crystal lattices projecting shield envelopes. The Catharan carrier sat rearward, ready to launch its fighter clouds. Human destroyers held the center, their boxy silhouettes in sharp contrast to their sleek counterparts. Sarah studied the formation on her display, already noting the gaps. "They've given us a parade formation," she muttered to her exec. "Why? Looks impressive, dies ugly." The first sign of the enemy was not a sensor blip, but a pattern in the comm traffic. Civilian haulers suddenly diverting routes, automated beacons going silent in sequence. Sarah had seen the tactic before: clear the lane, then hit it so hard no rescue can get through. When the Hegemonate arrived, they didn't charge. They appeared at extreme range in 3 groups, each angled to force the coalition to split its defenses. A textbook pincer against an opponent who would play by the book. The Zephyrian admiral's voice came over the tactical net, cool and measured. "We will divide our force to meet each axis of approach." Sarah cut in before orders could be finalized. "Negative, that's how they want us. They don't care which group breaks through as long as one does." "We cannot allow any to advance unopposed," the admiral insisted. Sarah's reply was flat. "We allow the flanks to feint. We hold center mass, and we kill their spearhead before it reaches the lane. Once they lose momentum, they lose the fight." It was not an argument Zephyrian officers liked, but the Catharan general sided with her. "Speed beats elegance here. We try her way." The enemy spearhead committed, 10 destroyers accelerating hard toward the center. Sarah's rails began charging, every ship in the human line synchronizing like a single mechanism. The Zephyrian cruisers shifted shield coverage forward, and the Catharan carrier launched interceptors to harry the flanks without overcommitting. At optimal range, Sarah gave the order. 12 tungsten projectiles leapt into the void at 15% of light speed. 4 Hegemonate ships vanished in under 10 seconds, their formation crumpling under the sudden loss of mass and coordination. The survivors tried evasive maneuvers, but Sarah's targeting crews were already feeding firing solutions into the next volley. The flanking enemy groups hesitated. Without their center punching through, the entire pincer lost its purpose. That hesitation was the real kill shot. Sarah redeployed human destroyers forward, rails charging again, forcing the enemy to either withdraw or feed more ships into the same kill zone. When the second volley landed, 2 more destroyers disintegrated, debris scattering into the passageway like shrapnel in slow motion. The rest broke off. The battle had lasted less than 15 minutes. Silence held on the tactical net until the Zephyrian admiral finally spoke. "Your methods are decisive." Sarah didn't gloat. "Decisive isn't enough. We hold this lane by making them decide never to test it again." But the real fight came hours later in the war room. Representatives from every coalition faction argued over what the victory meant. The Zephyrians wanted tighter command over human targeting protocols. The Catharans argued for broader deployment of kinetics. Ethereal envoys demanded a renewed discussion of proportionality. Maya, present as both diplomat and witness, cut through the noise. "We defended the passage without losing a single civilian ship. We did it by refusing to fight on terms the enemy expected. You can call it dangerous, but you can't call it reckless." One ethereal delegate replied sharply, "And when others adopt your methods without your discipline, you will have taught them how to slaughter without teaching them when not to." Maya met the gaze, or the fluid shape that passed for it. "That's why we train allies who are willing, and we don't hand blueprints to those who aren't. Restraint is not in the metal, it's in the mind. If you want the weapon, you have to want the ethic." Outside, Sarah and Maya walked the docking arm back to the determination. "They'll never admit it," Sarah said, "but today scared them more than it scared the enemy." "They're afraid of losing control," Maya said, "but control isn't the same as security. They just don't know the difference yet." Ahead, the stars over the Virely passage burned steady, the lane clear for now. But Sarah knew the hegemonate would be back, and the Council's fear might be harder to fight than any enemy fleet. 3 weeks after the Virely passage, the first signs of quiet sabotage began to surface. It started as a shipment delay, spare capacitor coils for the determination routed by mistake to a depot 6 systems away. Then came the software update from a Council logistics node that, when installed, halved the charging efficiency of every human rail system. The patch was flagged as stability improvements. Sarah's engineers tore it apart in an afternoon and found subroutines designed to throttle output under combat power loads. Maya confronted the High Counselor in open session. "Either your technicians are grossly incompetent, or you are testing ways to make our weapons fail." The crystalline figure flickered a pattern that translated into a politician's denial. "We merely seek to ensure operational safety across all member forces." Operational safety, Maya repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut the chamber's artificial calm. "Or operational control?" There was no direct answer, and that told her everything. While the Council played its game, the hegemonate shifted tactics. Intelligence reports spoke of new hull designs with layered sacrificial plating, intended to absorb a projectile's first penetration and disperse kinetic energy before it reached vital systems. It was crude, but crude sometimes worked. Sarah's staff ran simulations. The results were sobering. At standard engagement ranges, hit probability remained high, but projectile kill rates dropped by nearly 40% against the new armor. "They've accepted they can't stop the hit," Y said grimly. "So they're trying to survive it." "That's fine," Sarah said. "Physics is still on our side. We'll just hit harder." She ordered modifications to the fleet's loading protocols, denser projectiles, multi-round staggered fire designed to arrive milliseconds apart, each strike weakening the layer for the next. But heavier slugs meant slower reloads, and slower reloads meant fewer shots in the window before enemy formations could scatter. It was a trade-off, and trade-offs were where wars were won or lost. The next engagement came without warning. A convoy from the Rim League sent a distress call mid-transit, ambushed in the Kestrel Gap, a narrow corridor where gravity shear made maneuvering dangerous for large ships. When the Determination and her escorts arrived, they found the hegemonate waiting, their new-plated destroyers positioned like teeth along the passage. Sarah didn't waste time with formation speeches. "Target the lead pair," she ordered. "Double-tap pattern staggered 3 milliseconds, make a hole." The first volley stripped the plating, the second tore through the cores. 2 ships gone, but the others adapted fast, rolling to present fresh plating and angling their approach to narrow target profiles. Human rails fired again and again, but each kill took longer, and every second bought the enemy time to close on the convoy. Y's voice was tight. "Admiral, they're trying to pin us, force us to guard the convoy from point blank." Sarah understood instantly. At that range, railgun velocity advantage diminished and collision threats skyrocketed. It was the kind of tactic designed not just to win, but to humiliate. "Execute hammerfall," she said. The plan was simple, brutal, and dangerous. The fleet's smaller destroyers would thread the sheer currents at high acceleration, using the unstable gravity to slingshot into flanking positions. It risked structural stress on the ships, but if it worked, they'd hit the hegemonate from vectors their plating couldn't face in time. 3 minutes later, the gap lit with debris. 4 more enemy ships gone, the rest scattering. The convoy cleared the corridor without losing a single freighter. When the fleet returned, the political storm was immediate. Several council members accused Sarah of reckless disregard for asset safety, citing the structural strain on the human destroyers during the maneuver. Maya countered with footage of civilians in the convoy, safe, alive, grateful. "This is what asset safety looks like when you value lives over hull paint," she told the chamber. But beneath the argument lay the deeper truth. The hegemonate was learning, and the council was more worried about human independence than enemy adaptation. Sarah saw it in their eyes. They weren't asking how to win. They were asking how to win without needing her. In the war room that night, Sarah told Maya what she already knew. "They'll try to sideline us before the next battle." Maya didn't argue. "Then we need a fight they can't sideline us from, one so decisive that the war ends or the council admits it's not in charge anymore." The opportunity would come sooner than either of them expected. And when it did, it would decide not just the war, but humanity's place in the galaxy. The alert came in the middle of a strategy session. A Catharan relay station on the edge of the Terravel Crucible had gone silent, along with the Zephyrian mining complex tethered to the same gravitic anchor. The Crucible was a hazardous pocket of space, unstable gravity wells, debris from ancient asteroid collisions, and plasma storms that scrambled sensors. No one sent fleets there unless they had no choice. The council called an emergency assembly. High Counselor Thessel projected the system map, her crystal facets catching the light in patterns that almost looked nervous. "We believe the hegemonate is massing a fleet here," she said. "If they fortify the Crucible, they can strike into 3 trade lanes without warning." Sarah watched the faces around the table. Some wore worry, others wore calculation. She could tell which ones saw the danger and which ones saw opportunity. The Crucible was an ugly fight, and whoever went in could be blamed for the losses or take all the credit for a win. Maya read the mood, too. "Let me guess," she said. "You want humanity to lead the assault." The counselor's answer was smooth as glass. "Your recent success makes you the logical choice, and your kinetic weapons may function where energy systems are unreliable." Sarah spoke before Maya could. "You mean where your fleets don't want to risk their hulls?" There was no denial. The plan was deceptively simple. A coalition force would enter the Crucible through 3 separate vectors, box the hegemonate fleet against the gravitic storms, and crush them before they could withdraw. But the details were telling. Human destroyers were to spearhead the central approach, with the other forces positioned so far out they'd be spectators for the opening minutes. If the center collapsed, the whole formation would unravel, and the blame would fall squarely on Sarah. In private, Maya was blunt. "They want you to break the enemy or break yourself." Sarah smiled without humor. "Then we'll do the first so thoroughly they can't spin it into the second." 3 days later, the fleet jumped into the Crucible. The space beyond the jump point was a boiling mess of gravitational lensing and flickering plasma arcs. Visibility was poor, comms degraded, and the sensors painted everything in false colors. But Sarah's crews had trained for this, tracking by pattern recognition, not just by raw data. The hegemonate was waiting, 20 ships layered plating moving in tight formations to cover their flanks. They thought the terrain would slow human targeting solutions. They were wrong. Central line double staggered fire, Sarah ordered. 2 rounds per target. Aim to compromise the plating, then kill the core. The first volley hit like a hammer. Even through the storm, tungsten slugs ripped through the lead ships, the second impact hitting before their structural integrity could compensate for the first. 4 ships gone in the opening minute. But the enemy adapted fast, breaking into smaller elements and using the crucible's debris as cover. 1 human destroyer took a glancing hit from plasma scatter, losing one of its rail assemblies. Another was forced to maneuver hard to avoid a drifting mass that could have sheared it in half. On the outer approaches, the Zephyrian and Catharan elements reported navigational complications, a careful phrase that meant they weren't closing fast enough to matter. Sarah saw the trap tightening. If the humans took too long to finish, the enemy could punch through the weakened center and turn the battle into a rout. She keyed to the fleet-wide channel. We break them now. Hammerfall sequence, every ship that can fire, fire. Load heavy density. Ignore secondary targets. For 30 seconds, the crucible was nothing but kinetic thunder. Every rail on every human destroyer discharged in disciplined chaos, staggering impact so that plating shattered just as the next slug arrived. The hegemonate line disintegrated, first in pieces, then in spirit. What remained scattered into the storm. By the time the outer coalition wings arrived, the battle was over. The kill count was clean. 16 enemy ships destroyed, 4 disabled and drifting. No civilian assets lost. 2 human ships were damaged but operational. In the aftermath, the council chambers were tense. The official record credited the coalition, but everyone knew the truth. Without the humans, the battle would have been a disaster. An ethereal delegate tried to reclaim the narrative. Your methods are effective but unpredictable. The crucible was a fortunate alignment of variables. Maya leaned forward. You call it fortune, we call it preparation. And preparation can be taught if you want to learn. The High Counselor's crystalline form flickered with something between irritation and calculation. And the technology, Sarah's voice was cold steel, comes with the training and the ethic, or it doesn't come at all. There was no applause, no declaration of trust. But in the glances traded between delegates, Sarah and Maya saw the shift. The galaxy could no longer pretend that humanity's victories were luck, or that they could be excluded from deciding how the war would end. That decision was coming, and it would not be made in the council chambers. The first signal came as a distortion in the Rim League's deep-range gravimetric network, a ripple too large to be natural, too coordinated to be random. Hours later, scout drones confirmed what the math had already told Sarah. The hegemonate had committed its full remaining fleet. 40 warships supported by auxiliary carriers and a logistics chain that could keep them fighting for weeks. It was not a raid. It was an ending. The council convened in emergency session. Their strategy was as cautious as it was predictable. Gather all remaining coalition forces, form a layered defense in the Corridon corridor, a long, narrow stretch of space leading directly to the core trade routes, and hope to grind the enemy down through attrition. Sarah listened without speaking. In that plan, humanity's destroyers would be placed deep in the reserve line, too far back to influence the opening stages of the battle, just close enough to mop up survivors, a perfect way to keep them from shaping the outcome, no matter what the final score was. When the session adjourned, Maya caught her in the corridor. "They're trying to win without us," she said. "If it works, they get the glory. If it fails, they can say we refuse to follow orders." Sarah's answer was quiet but certain. "Then we don't follow their plan, we make our own, and we make it so fast they can't stop it." In the war room aboard the Determination, her senior officers gathered around a projection of the Corridon corridor. "If we wait in reserve, the hegemonate punches through the front line in the first 2 hours, Y said. "By the time we engage, the fight's already lost." Sarah traced a finger along a point halfway down the corridor, a region littered with ancient mining debris and derelict platforms. Here, we turn it into a kill box. Railgun arcs from multiple vectors overlapping fire zones. The debris gives us concealment and cover, and we hit them before they even reach the main defense line. It means going in ahead of the coalition, her tactical officer said. Without support. Sarah met every gaze in the room. We've done that before, but this time we're not bait, we're the blade. The plan was set in motion before the council could interfere. Under the cover of prepositioning maneuvers, the human fleet jumped into the debris field and began placing autonomous firing platforms, rail assemblies stripped from older hulls, wired into remote targeting systems, powered by hastily modified fusion packs. They were ugly, improvised, and deadly. When the hegemonate entered the corridor, they were in attack formation, tight lines, layered shields, confidence radiating in every maneuver. They expected the coalition defense wall to be further ahead. Instead, they found silence, and then the first tungsten slug ripped through a cruiser's bow, tearing half its spine away in an instant. Rail platforms fired in synchronized salvos, guided by human destroyers weaving between debris. Every shot was staggered to exploit the chaos, first to strip plating, then to shatter the core, then to send debris into the path of ships still trying to accelerate. The hegemonate tried to adapt, but in the debris field their formations broke apart. Their point defenses struggled to track projectiles coming from half a dozen hidden vectors at once. Every attempt to maneuver into open space only exposed them to another angle of fire. On the coalition command channel, voices rose in disbelief. The Zephyrian admiral demanded to know why human ships were engaging ahead of the plan. Maya, monitoring from the determination, cut into the feed. "We're not ahead of the plan," she said. "We're executing the only plan that wins." Within 40 minutes, the center of the hegemonate formation had collapsed. Their forward momentum was gone, replaced by retreat vectors and fragmented communications. Human destroyers pressed the advantage, driving wedges between retreating groups, forcing more kills and more surrenders. When the coalition main line finally engaged, it was against an enemy already broken. The Corridon corridor was secure. The war, though not officially declared over, had lost its last real gamble. In the council chamber the next day, the mood was brittle. The victory was too large to ignore, but the method too independent to forgive. The High Counselor's words were smooth but sharp. "You acted without authorization. You risked the stability of the coalition command." Sarah's reply was calm, steady. "I acted to ensure there was still a coalition to command. If you want obedience at the cost of victory, I'm not your admiral. If you want survival, you know where to find me." Maya stepped forward, seizing the moment before they could retreat into protocol. "We've shown you the path to end this war. Now the choice is yours. Keep fighting for control or start fighting for the galaxy." No one answered, but in the silence, Sarah recognized the shift. The council might never admit it out loud, but they knew. Humanity hadn't just been a participant in the war. They had ended it on their own terms. The question now was whether the peace that followed would be built the same way. The official end of hostilities was signed in a hall that had seen more lies than truths in its long history. The banners of every coalition world hung in symmetrical order, the same way they had during the worst days of the war, because decorum was easier to preserve than trust. Cameras captured the moment the hegemonate delegates placed their marks on the treaty. What the footage didn't show was the calculation in their eyes. Maya stood beside Sarah at the reception, the air thick with political perfume and forced laughter. Delegations from across the galaxy approached with the same tone they might use for a dangerous animal praise, coupled with the unspoken hope that it would remain behind a sturdy fence. "You feel it too," Maya said quietly, watching the Zephyrian ambassador shake hands as if handling explosives. Sarah nodded. "They are relieved we ended the war. Now they're scared we could end something else." The fear wasn't unfounded. In the months following Corridon, Human kinetic doctrine had become the most studied military subject in known space. Allied fleets asked for training programs. Neutral states sent envoys offering trade concessions in exchange for limited technology sharing. Even some worlds that had stayed out of the war entirely were suddenly eager to build security partnerships with Earth. But behind closed doors, Maya received reports of sabotage attempts, stolen prototype components showing up in black markets, intelligence probes against Earth's shipyards, encrypted communications between hegemonate remnants and factions within the Council itself. Peace had not ended the struggle. It had simply changed its rules. Sarah spent those months overseeing joint exercises, drilling crews from half a dozen species in the principles that had carried humanity through the war. Precision over volume, timing over spectacle, discipline over ego. But she also saw the tension in every foreign officer's eyes, the same question they all carried. What happens if the humans turn this on us? One afternoon, after a training session with a Catharan fleet wing, a junior officer approached Sarah in the docking bay. His voice was respectful, but his question was blunt. "Admiral, what guarantee do we have that humanity will never use these weapons to dominate the Council?" Sarah looked him in the eye. "No weapon comes with that guarantee. The only promise is the one we keep with ourselves, and the one you keep with yours. That's why I'm teaching you everything except complacency." He left with more to think about than he had expected. So did she. Meanwhile, the hegemonate remnants were not idle. Recon sweeps picked up isolated ship movements near the fractured moons of Deneth Roman 9, too organized for pirates, too small for a formal fleet. It was the kind of activity that precedes insurgency. Sarah requested permission to investigate with a human-led task force. The Council delayed the approval, citing jurisdictional review. Maya read between the lines. They're afraid if you're the one to put down whatever's brewing, you'll gain even more influence, and they'd rather risk a crisis than give you that leverage. That night, Sarah made her decision. The Determination and 2 escorts departed under the cover of a navigation systems calibration run. Officially, it was maintenance. In practice, it was a hunt. What they found confirmed every suspicion. 3 hegemonate cruisers, retrofitted with hybrid drives and stripped of insignia, shepherding a convoy of transports loaded with weapons components. It wasn't just survival, it was preparation. Sarah ordered an intercept. The railguns fired with clinical precision, disabling the cruisers before they could scatter. Boarding teams secured the transports. The entire operation took under an hour. By the time the Council's jurisdictional review concluded, Sarah's task force was already back in dock. The official statement was a masterpiece of political fiction. An incidental encounter during routine operations resulted in the recovery of illicit arms shipments. The truth spread faster in military channels. Humanity had once again acted before the bureaucracy even knew where to look. The incident deepened the divide. Allies saw competence and resolve. Rivals saw a precedent for unilateral action. And in the middle of it all, Sarah felt the weight of the question she had been asked in the docking bay. What guarantee could she give? One evening, she stood on the Determination's observation deck, looking at the blue curve of a Council world below. Maya joined her, carrying 2 mugs of coffee that still steamed in the recycled air. "They're already planning for the next war," Maya said. "They just haven't decided who it's against." Sarah took a sip, her eyes still on the planet. "Then our job is the same as it was in the last one. Make sure we're ready and make sure we're still the kind of people who only fight when we have to." Maya studied her face. "And if one day it's the Council itself?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. "Then we'll remind them what we reminded the hegemonate. Physics doesn't care who writes the rules, but ethics decide when you pull the trigger. We can't lose one just because we've mastered the other." In the silence that followed, the stars seemed closer than usual, as if listening. The war was over, but the test of humanity's place in the galaxy had only begun. 6 months after the treaty signing, the galaxy had settled into a fragile rhythm that called itself peace. Trade lanes reopened, patrol schedules thinned, and politicians returned to the theater of speeches instead of battle reports. But under the quiet, the same forces that had driven the war shifted and twisted, seeking new ways to protect what they had or take what they didn't. For humanity, the months were a blur of invitations and warnings. Some worlds asked for joint defense pacts, promising loyalty in exchange for a handful of rail platforms. Others, more subtle, offered resource rights and political favors if Earth would discourage rivals. And there were the darker requests, the ones that asked for what no treaty would permit, delivered in the kind of language that left deniability hanging in the air. Maya refused them all with the same steadiness. "Our technology isn't a bargaining chip," she told one ambassador. "It's a responsibility. We'll share it with those who share the ethic, not those who want the weapon without the restraint." The pressure inside the council was worse. Proposals for joint oversight of human shipyards multiplied, each dressed in the rhetoric of cooperation, but carrying the bones of control. Reports of espionage increased. A Zephyrian officer was caught trying to smuggle a human targeting core out of a training exercise. The ethereal delegation called for binding agreements on proportional force, hoping to shackle the very method that had won the war. Sarah kept her fleet drilling, refining, learning. In the Corridon kill box, she'd proved that victory came from anticipating the fight the enemy didn't expect. Now she applied the same principle to politics. Prepare for the strike that came from the hand that claimed friendship. The test came without fanfare. An emergency signal from the Farsight relay, a deep space observation post co-manned by human and Rim League crews, reported multiple unidentified vessels inbound, transmitting no IFF. The council debated for 2 hours whether to dispatch a fleet. Sarah had already left dock after 15 minutes. When the determination arrived, the attackers were in the middle of boarding operations. The ships bore no insignia, but their drives and weapon profiles were unmistakable. Ex-hegemonate hulls refitted with council-spec shield generators. Someone had given them the means to survive railgun fire, someone inside the council. Sarah didn't wait for authorization. Her destroyers moved in fast, targeting not the ships but the docking umbilicals connecting them to the relay. One by one, tungsten slugs cut the boarding bridges apart, severing the attack before it could finish. The enemy ships tried to flee, 2 didn't make it. Later in the council chamber, the debate was poisonous. Some delegates praised the swift action. Others accused humanity of escalating a situation that might have been resolved diplomatically. Sarah didn't bother with political polish. The only diplomacy being practiced at the Farsight relay was at gunpoint, she said. "If you want to dress that up as negotiation, don't ask my fleet to attend." The room went still. No one challenged her directly, but the lines were clearer than ever. Allies on one side, opportunists and rivals on the other. And in the middle, humanity, too strong to be dismissed, too principled to be easily controlled. That night, Sarah and Maya met in the quiet of the observation deck. Below them, the station lights curved against the black, each one a reminder of why they fought. "They're going to keep testing us," Maya said. "Not just our weapons, our patience." Sarah nodded. "And we'll keep giving them the same answer. We fight when we must. We fight to end the fight, and we don't let anyone turn our strength into their ambition." Maya looked out at the star field, her voice softer now. "Do you think we can keep it that way? Forever?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She thought about every page of human history, the wars fought for freedom, the ones fought for pride, and the hard truth that even good intentions could rot if left unchecked. "No," she said finally. "Not forever. But long enough to teach the next generation why it matters, long enough for them to understand that power without ethics isn't strength, it's weakness in armor." A silence settled between them, the kind that didn't need filling. Down on the planet, a school teacher in a Rim League settlement was telling her students about the battle at Corridon. She described the railguns, the precision, the discipline. But more than that, she described the choice to hold fire when the target wasn't a threat. She told them that was what made the difference between victory and dominance. In the years to come, the galaxy would change again. New alliances would rise, old grudges would resurface, and humanity would face choices as hard as any war. But in that moment, under the cold light of the stars, Sarah believed they had given the galaxy something worth keeping. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the universe was the one you chose not to fire. And that, if anything, was the legacy worth defending.